Hello, y'all, and welcome back to my channel. As you can see, I'll be talking about The Hazel Wood by Melissa Albert today, not to be confused with the author, Ali Hazelwood. So without further ado, let's get into it. Why did I pick up this book? Well, it started because I had received a ton of Barnes & Noble gift cards for my birthday, and this was back when I was still in the reading slump and hadn't read anything for fun in a very long time. So I was just browsing through books in Barnes & Noble and found the premise of this one interesting. I always love reading fairy tales and fantasy novels, and this seemed right up my alley with a bit of a dark twist, so I decided to give it a shot. Please excuse my voice. It's the morning. Here's a synopsis off of Goodreads. 17-year-old Alice and her mother have spent most of Alice's life on the road, always a step ahead of the uncanny bad luck biting at their heels. But when Alice's grandmother, the reclusive author of a cult classic book of pitch dark fairy tales, dies alone in her estate, the Hazel Wood, Alice learns how bad her luck can really get. Her mother is stolen away by a figure who claims to come from the hinterland, the cruel supernatural world where her grandmother's stories are set. Alice's only lead is the message her mother left behind: stay away from the Hazel Wood. Alice has long steered clear of her grandmother's cultish fans, but now she has no choice but to ally with classmate Ellery Finch, a hinterland superfan who may have his own reasons for wanting to help her. To retrieve her mother, Alice must venture first to the Hazel Wood, then into the world where her grandmother's tales began, and where she might find out how her own story went so wrong. Interesting premise, right? Well, I thought so too. Yes, it's true that it took me 4-ish years to complete this book. I started it back in sophomore year of high school, and I finished it the summer of my sophomore year in college. Why? Well, to be fair, it was a combination of me not having enough time and also me finding the beginning pretty slow. I did read about half of it in a few days while on vacation, though, so it wasn't like it was a total snooze fest. Let's start with good stuff. The descriptions in this book are fantastic. There's definitely no white room syndrome here, and Albert doesn't just describe what's there, she describes it in an interesting and creative way. One of my favorites is where Ellery Finch is driving and his hands are positioned at 10 and 2 o'clock, like he's holding up a shirt. I think it's just such a fun description for something so simple, and it's really stuck in my mind. The premise and overall concept is pretty creative, and I quite enjoyed reading all the short fairy tale stories included within the bigger narrative. The best part of this book was the middle section. I found it very tense and suspenseful, and there were moments where I had to put the book down just to take a moment because it was legitimately making me anxious. I mentioned before that the beginning was a little slow, and I didn't love the ending either. There was a lot of info and backstory dumping going on, a little too much for my liking, and a lot of the times it just took too long to get to the point. The characters in this book were alright. I see a lot of people hating on Alice, the main character, but I didn't think she was that bad. Yeah, she's a little crass and rough around the edges, and she has anger issues, but she's not annoying. Honestly, her worst offense to me is that she's just not at all that interesting. Unfortunately, I didn't really get attached to any of the characters all that much in this book. If you've seen my Monster Long Six of Crows review, I'm someone who needs characters to grow to attach to in order to really love a story. And the ones in this one just didn't really do it for me, unfortunately. So, I'd rate this book a 3.5 stars and 7 out of 10. It's not my favorite book ever, but it's not without its merits, and I can see why other people would like it. There's a sequel, but I'm not really compelled to read it. I may or may not along the line if I ever revisit this book, but at this point, I'm not really interested in reading on because this book kind of wraps up well enough. Alright, let's get into the spoiler portion and summary review. I realize the synopsis basically explains the entire first section of this book. Alice and her mother Ella are constantly on the run from bad luck and super fans of Ella's mother, Althea Porcupine's book. When they receive news of Althea's death, they think they're in the clear. They settle down in New York and her mom gets married, albeit it's a rocky marriage. Alice goes to a fancy private school where she meets the ultra-rich Ellery Finch, who is also a super fan of Althea's writings. One day, Ella goes missing, and Alice turns to Ellery for answers. By the way, the book refers to him as Finch, but I wrote the whole script referring to him as Ellery, and I'm too lazy to change it, so I'm going to keep calling him Ellery. Anyway, Alice had never read any of her grandmother's books before because her mom always kept it away from her, and so she hopes to find answers to where her mom could have gone in those stories, and she turns to Ellery for that. His copy of the book was stolen, unfortunately, I think, but he remembers the stories well enough. He starts to tell her the one called Alice 3 times, per her request, but he stops before he finishes when he sees someone who matches the description of a character from a different one of Althea's stories. Side tangent, this book makes mention of Peter and the Starcatchers, which is a fun little bridge between this and the last book I read. Anyway, Alice and Ellery travel together, making use of Ellery's money supply to fund their lodging, meals, and travels. I'm going to go on another tangent, but I can't help it. My brother and I noticed that superhero teams usually need a rich guy to help fund their endeavors because I doubt hero work pays very well. It's kind of funny, but also makes sense that to have a rich character on your side solves a lot of those little tedious problems. Anyway, Alice and Ellery track down a blogger named Ness who allegedly made it to the Hinterland, which is the supposedly fictional place where the stories take place. Ness talks to Alice and tells her not to go there. She lost a companion there, and when she returned to the real world, she aged rapidly and now feels like a shell of her former self. The pictures of a goat, because it made a small, there's a detail about her seemingly having goat eyes. I don't know. Alice and Ellery continue to travel along, seeing characters from Althea's stories out in the wild. Ellery shares with her another one of Althea's stories involving a portador thing being opened with blood. Hang on to that because it'll be relevant later. Ellery has a nightmare one night, and when he wakes, he suggests they turn around. Alice is startled because he was originally a super enthusiastic about the crest, being a fan and all, but now he's having doubts. Alice also talks in her sleep, and Ellery overhears what she says, but says it was nothing important. Yeah, totally. It's revealed later that she was talking about a feather, a bone, and a comb. Once again, hang on to that. I'll come back later. So there's more traveling. A lot of this book is traveling, but for some reason I like these parts. Even though I didn't love the characters, their interactions were quite entertaining still. Also, the building tension and dread worked really well for me, as I mentioned earlier. In a kind of shocking turn of events, Ellery's regret gets to him and he reveals he made a deal with one of the book characters, twice called Catherine, to get Alice to the Hazel Wood, aka Althea's estate. Have I mentioned that yet? I don't know. But anyway, Catherine and other two Hinterland characters catch them. Catherine tells Alice to off herself. Alice makes an attempt to escape and save Finch, but he ends up getting his throat slit. And at this point, I paused and I was like, I absolutely refuse he dies here because that was way too sudden. There was like not enough build up, and there's no way they just killed off the second main character in this super hurried fashion. And he doesn't die. Well, this is the spoiler section, but he doesn't die. And I was right. Moving on. Okay, this whole last part in the Hinterland Hazelwood story world is pretty confusing to summarize, but I'll try my best. This part flip-flops between beautiful but long-winded descriptions and backstory info dumps, and I can't really say I'm a fan. This is a part I didn't really like all that much. So stuff happens, the portal opens, Alice finds herself in the halfway wood, basically a bridge between reaching the Hinterland or the Hazelwood, something like that. Alice runs into more book characters and uses the comb, bone, and feather to advance further. She eventually meets her grandmother Althea. Althea reveals that Alice is actually a character from in the Hinterland Tale Alice 3 times, and Alice stole her away from the halfway wood when Alice was just a baby. Characters from the Hinterland have tried to get her back ever since, and that's the reason behind their constant bad luck. Now, the dumb part about this, I think, is that if Ella didn't want Alice to know about her past and where she came from, why would she keep her name the same? Of course, she would instantly gravitate to her grandmother's story involving a character with that same name. I mean, that's the whole reason this works out, because she figured Alice 3 times had something to do with her, and it was true. So there. Well, anyway, Alice meets a woman named Janet, Althea's former lover, living with the other real-world people who end up in the story world. Janet explains that when Althea took the stories from this world and wrote about them in the real world, it caused bridges allowing the characters to escape. Alice meets the story spinner, who's basically the real author of all these stories. And the story spinner tries to force Alice back into her own story, but Alice escapes with the help of Janet and Finch, who is in fact still alive. I told you. Alice returns to the real world while Ellery opts to stay behind. Alice reunites with Ella, kabing kaboom, the end of the story. I put a bicycle because this final part involves them traveling by bike, and it's a little funny to me. Anyway, I really like the concepts and ideas presented in the story. The idea that Alice doesn't know the end of her character's story and thus chooses to forge her own is neat. The idea that the characters like her, or stories with a capital S, as they're referred to in the book, are constantly reliving their stories with a lowercase s in this context until the story isn't worth retelling is interesting. The atmosphere was great and the ideas were creative. The handling of the entire last act to me was a little clunky for my taste. I might find some enjoyment rereading it in a few years though, and hopefully it won't take me 4 years to finish that reread. Well, that's all for me. That's all for me today. School is starting up again, and we'll see what it does to my posting schedule. If you enjoy, please like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. I really appreciate it, and I'll catch you all next time. Bye!